Stephen Zunes. He's a professor of politics and director of Middle Eastern Studies at University of San Francisco. Professor, let's start with your take on Hamas's suspending of the hostage release, which comes at a very delicate moment in this ceasefire agreement. Just how serious do you think this threat is, and how fragile is the current deal?
Well, the concerns that the Hamas has expressed are fairly serious. Israel delaying the return of displaced people to the northern Gaza Strip. There have been incidents of shelling and gunfire at these returning refugees, not allowing the entry of relief supplies in all the forms that they had agreed to previously, and including tents, prefabricated houses, fuel, rubble moving mechanisms, and also concerns about delay of essential medicines and hospital supplies. So the concerns that Hamas has raised are probably legitimate, but whether this will mean they will actually delay the return of the hostages and risk a resumption of the war, or this is just a negotiating tactic to try to get the Israelis to move on these issues, that remains to be seen.
Well, Professor, speaking of negotiating tactics, we're just seeing some comments from President Trump there saying if all the Gaza hostages unreturned by Saturday at 12 p.m., I would say cancel the ceasefire. So how seriously are you taking Donald Trump's words? I mean, for most of the things that he's threatened to do, he's actually carried out. For example, that ceasefire, and now he's threatening to cancel it. So how seriously would you take his words?
Well, ultimately, it's up to Hamas and Israel whether they cancel it or not. But Trump and his officials did play a role in finalizing the ceasefire. But what we've seen historically, and this is true of Democratic presidents as well as Republican ones, is that when there are disputes between Israel and its Arab neighbors, whether they be extremist groups like Hamas or more moderate forces, that the United States tends to side with Israel in its interpretation and has generally supported Israel when it's resumed the conflict. So, I mean, I think that certainly the Hamas people are certainly aware of this, but at the same time, you have the fact that Netanyahu, with all these legal troubles hounding him and threat of investigations about the tragedy of October 7th and the like, that it may be in his interest to resume the fighting anyway. So it's hard to say, even if Hamas is using this as kind of a feint. We are in very dangerous territory right now with the very real possibility of resuming the war.
Yeah, I mean, and earlier, Trump's plan for the U.S. to kind of take ownership of Gaza, it has been almost universally rejected, but he continues to push this idea until, the most recent lines dropping. Realistically, can he go ahead with it despite objection from allies, Arab states, and what's in it for the U.S.?
Well, Israel would presumably, since Trump has ruled out using American forces, would have to physically drive the Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip. I mean, Israel has engaged in this kind of ethnic cleansing before. Indeed, majority of the population of the Gaza Strip are survivors or the offspring, descendants of survivors of the original ethnic cleansing back in 1948, 49. But this would be obviously an incredibly provocative move. It would get universal condemnation. Indeed, ethnic cleansing was the reasons the United States gave, and as well as other NATO powers, for going to war twice in the former Yugoslavia. So I'm rather dubious that the Israelis and the Americans would actually go through with it. But the very fact that they are suggesting it and seemingly serious about it does underscore that the United States and Israel are in many ways real outliers in the international community in terms of some very basic principles of international law.
We still do have some days left until that Saturday deadline, Professor. Can this deal be salvaged? I mean, what needs to happen to ensure this continuation of the deal and avoid further escalation?
I think what may happen is that Israel could agree to improve the flow of materials into the Gaza Strip and allow more people to return. Perhaps not all the issues that Hamas has raised, but at least some of them. So there'd be some kind of face-saving by both sides to prevent it from going, because really it's in nobody's interest to resume the war. And the Palestinians obviously have suffered enormously under the Israeli bombardment, and they are also not very happy with Hamas for how Hamas made this war possible through the terrorist attacks and their rather heavy-handed rule over that territory for all these years. So, whatever happens, between Hamas and Israel, ultimately it's the Palestinian people who are suffering, and it would be a real tragedy to see them suffer even more with a resumption of the fighting.
Yeah, Professor, I know what you say, it's nobody's interest to resume the war, yet why do both sides keep, threatening to kind of delay or suspend or basically, do any action that kind of puts that whole ceasefire in jeopardy?
Well, neither Hamas nor the Israeli government have the support of the majority of their people. And there is nothing like the war or a threat of war to get people to rally around the flag, in a sense. So I really think that this is more political posturing than anything. But there really is a humanitarian issue here. The hostages who've been suffering under all these months under Hamas captivity, as well as the Palestinian prisoners, some of which who are indeed violent militant, but the majority of whom are nonviolent people who've been swept up in various mass arrests. And of course, the people in Gaza who have suffered so much, who are trying to rebuild and indeed trying to just get the basic supplies, given that their infrastructure has been largely destroyed. So, I think the important thing is for the international community is to focus on the victims of this conflict, and to not allow the political leaders to manipulate their suffering anymore for their political advantage.
And Professor, how do you think the upcoming meeting between King Abdullah of Jordan and President Trump will unfold, especially given Trump's that doubling down on his controversial Gaza plan and recent remarks suggesting that Jordan and Egypt should take in Palestinians?
Well, Jordan has already taken in large numbers of Palestinian refugees from the original expulsion back in 1948. Indeed, the majority of Jordanians are of Palestinian ancestry, and they're clearly not in a position to take more, and have made very clear about that. Egypt doesn't have as many Palestinian refugees, but they have a hard time enough feeding their own people, so they're not going to be open to bringing in more folks as well. At the same time, both Jordan and Egypt are very dependent on the United States for foreign aid and diplomatic support, military equipment, and the like. And Trump will probably try to pressure them on one thing or another, but I don't see them changing their position right in terms of accepting more Palestinian refugees. I think both will be quite firm in continuing to say no.
All right, Professor, many thanks for joining us this morning. Stephen Zunes, he is Professor of Politics and Director of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of San Francisco.